Good morning, folks, and welcome to the first panel of the 5th annual Scottish International Film Education Conference. I'll just give it a couple of minutes to allow people to continue to filter in. My name is Robert Munro. I am an associate editor at the Film Education Journal, which is tied to the Film Education Conference. And I'm standing in today for the journal's editor-in-chief, Dr. Jamie Chambers from Edinburgh College of Art, who caught COVID last week and is still feeling a wee bit groggy. We are expecting him later on in the conference, but he's just pacing himself. So very pleased to welcome you all here. There's another great looking panel that we've got to kick us off today, and I'll introduce you to the panel chair in a minute. We are also launching a new edition of the journal in June at the moment. It's the first ever special edition that we've released called Decolonising Film Education. Many thanks to the co-editors of that, Professor Jyoti Mistry and Dr. Lizelle Bischoff, who have curated a really fantastic edition. We'll put the link to that in the chat, and please have a look at that at your leisure as well. We have a new edition, or we have a call for papers for a forthcoming edition of the journal, and the deadline for that is August 15th. If you are interested, please have a look at the Film Education Journal website and send us an email. Come to either myself or Jamie to have a look at. I'd also like to thank our sponsors, Screen Scotland, the British Film Institute and the Italian Cultural Institute for helping us fund and run the conference this year. There's a few other people we wanted to say thanks to just quickly before we begin as well, who have been part of the journey of the journal and the conference over the last 5 years. Firstly to Scott Donaldson, who recently retired as head of film education at Screen Scotland, who's been a real kind of champion of the journal and the conference over the past 5 years. Also our editor at the University of College London Press, Pat Gordon-Smith, who has kind of moved to a different area at UCL, who again has been absolutely instrumental to the journal's success over the past 5 years. She's really helped us to establish herself as a respectful journal. And also to our former administrator, Flip Kovacevic, who moved on to Pastures New, to a permanent position in February, who again has been an absolutely fantastic asset to the journal and the conference over the past 5 years, and some of you have been with us before will have received emails for her. And on that note, welcome to Pascal, who is our new administrator, and he'll be the person, here he comes on the screen there, giving you a little wave. He'll be helping to marshal all your questions throughout the Q&A sessions across the next few days. So thank you for attending. Thanks to all the speakers and the attendees. Look forward to a couple of fantastic days of the conference. Without any more from me, I'll now pass on to Professor Andrew Burn, who is on the editorial board of the Film Education Journal and is chairing our first panel this morning.
Thanks, Robert, and hello everybody. Welcome to the conference. As Robert said, we've got an exciting first panel to kick off with, so I'll introduce them without more ado. As you've seen from the programme, this is a panel that draws on papers that have been published in the journal, and we have 3 presenters today who are going to talk about their papers, perhaps represent them or perhaps expand on aspects of them. And we're looking forward to hearing that. It's great that we have, representatives of our international research community here from, in this case, from Greece, Denmark, and the United States. And we've had great international representation at this conference since it's been online, actually, which is one of the great benefits. So I will introduce the first speaker in a minute. Just to say before that we would welcome, of course, questions. We'll have a brief 5-minute slot at the end of each speaker so we can have some immediate questions that spring to mind, and then we'll have a longer session at the end for questions and answers and discussion. So please post questions. There are 2 buttons you can use for this. You can use the Q&A button, or you can use the chat button. And of course you can also raise your hand when we come to the question sessions, and it would be great to hear voices if people are willing to speak their questions to us directly rather than pasting them into the chat box or the Q&A box. We also need to say that if any of you need to see captions, there are two ways to do this. One way is to click the closed caption button at the bottom, and then you'll see them. And there's another more elaborate way where you get a separate open window over which you have some control for sizing and movement and so on. And the instructions for that have been pasted in the chat. So please do follow that if you need to. Okay, so without more ado, onto our exciting panel, and it's a great pleasure to introduce first Maria Leonida from Athens. And Maria is she's a film director. She's a professional film director. You can check out her credentials, and she's also co-founder of KARPOS, which is the Centre for Education and Intercultural Communication in Athens. She's a veteran educator and film educator, has been doing this for a very long time, and I'm glad to hear, as she's just said in the chat we had before, that this is all opening up face to face again now after the pandemic. Her work is shown in her article for the FEJ, for the Film Education Journal, and this particular article shows her kind of expansive interest across the arts beyond just filmmaking, and particularly the combination of drama and filmmaking in this instance in the representation of refugee young people in Greece. So her presentation today is called From Film to Theatre and From Theatre to Film, and I look forward to hearing it. Over to you, Maria. You need to unmute, of course.
Okay, so thanks, Andrew. Thanks very much. Anyway, I want to thank Andrew again because he was of great assistance when finalizing this specific article. So it's been a great pleasure to work with him and have his feedback. As Andrew said, my approach is the one of someone who's been into filmmaking and is very interested into research and education since many years. I will start by sharing my screen to check if everything is technically okay. Would that be fine?
Perfect. Thanks very much, Maria.
So this is the title, as it was said. And yes, it's true that I've been interested quite for a long time in mingling or stealing ideas from other arts and other forms and other formats and genres. I recently wrote another article about combining English language and photography and filmmaking for adult refugees. So again, it was a co-teaching experience that we were researching. So back to the article for the Film Education Journal. It is an account of a very specific teacher training that happened quite a long time now. I think the pandemic creates these gaps often. But still, I was looking at the article again with a fresh look, and I was wondering, why should one read it since it's not very fresh anymore? However, I think my approach, also coming from a small organization and being a documentary filmmaker, is that we need to be able to do film education or media literacy with a less means possible. So I always find solutions around showing to other people, facilitating the core concepts of media language, even with the less means. So it's not about iPads, it's about a way of thinking. And this is my approach. So I would like to develop on that. You have to imagine, I will be honest, I'm based in Greece, and I've been several times invited in Germany, and arriving for a 2.5 days training, which I was very honored to be their trainer. You can imagine the German people, experienced theater pedagogues, arrived with a suitcase full of iPads and very modern equipment. So then you have to think, what can I offer here? And I think what I could offer is a kind of understanding the storytelling behind film literacy. And this is something that often people who are capable in technology have not always grasped. I think that is quite interesting. My concept was that I would really need to show what's the importance of the close-up and the detail. I believe that the close-up and the detail is very crucial, as the aim of the whole workshop was actually to engage and help teachers to understand the different aspects of film language and use it for their own pedagogy practice. and obviously build upon their existing skills, because we have to remember in 2016, everybody was familiar with smartphones, everybody was familiar with some tablets, and it was very much in fashion to make films in schools, so that was not a problem. But still, since 20 years that I'm working in teacher training and film education, I find that the needs are similar. People in the pedagogy area still feel the need to obtain more confidence. They know the equipment is there, now it's even cheaper, but what are the ways and the processes that we can actually construct this confidence and the understanding of using them with another group, because this is the role of a teacher, to facilitate another group, which in this case, the youngsters are much more experienced and they're all the time getting more and more experienced. So my aim was to help them understand what would be the core concept of their own skill in addressing media making. Oops. Sorry. Okay. So one of the things I worked through these 2.5 days was the connection of body language, which is something that a teacher, a pedagogue, and especially a theater pedagogue, who were the majority of my trainees at that time, can be very closely connected to technology. Usually I find that in film education, film analysis, we approach only the technological part, only the analytical part in a more intellectual way. While I have learned a lot of things from theater pedagogues who use very much the bodily expression, the circular practices, and the aspects of communication much more than people in film do. And this is understandable, because film, I find, is a very intellectual and cerebral process. It's quite a complicated thing to edit. So that makes us all become more analytical and more focusing on detail. So we forget of other communicative aspects. So as I said, my aim was to help the teachers start really looking through the frame. We think it's something that we do, but I actually don't believe we do. And still, the last 3 years in all my work, I have this conviction that although everybody now has a mobile phone in their pocket, people don't really realize what they put inside the frame. So I find that the questions are pertinent over time. This is a table that you will find in the article, which actually shows my methodology and my way of thinking. I was trying to combine the kind of activities, which is a very, we need to be hands-on in our work, to connect it closely to which element of film language that each activity would primordially connect, what kind of method I would use to offer it to the people, to the group, because there are many methods to use a film element. I find that we can use issues from viewing and analysis, from trying out shooting, from discussion, from sound recording, from combining video with text. So there are all sorts of methods. And also there are methods that don't involve technology. I'm trying a lot to work, and I'm explaining this in the article as well, that maybe we can also use and teach media even without technology, because we can teach concepts, we can teach ways of thinking, and that would be my aim. Then there are many communication tools, from our voice to photography, from video to sound. So we have to be aware as trainers which exactly tool we are using. And finally, as devices are becoming more multiple and more varied, I think we also, in constructing a training, we need to think closely which device would be more suitable for each activity, for each method, for each communication tool. So I'm not going to go further, but I believe that this table helped both me and my structuring of the content to be able to be more understandable. Going on, I would like to start opposite now, to give some of the feedback we received after the training, to show exactly what was the need. When a person who is quite experienced theater pedagogue and is teaching in high school says that they realize how pictures can be precise, how we have to be precise with pictures, because you use only what you can see, and it's crucial that they say everything else will be left outside. This is the main core concept of framing. So I believe that there is still a very big need to teach what framing exactly can mean. And the other basic need I find with teacher communities is it's not always easy to connect steps one to another, is what I said in the beginning about the storytelling of film education. At least in my opinion, the training has to involve a series of activities that interconnect one another and develop the understanding of film language in little portions. I think that film itself is a huge thing, as I said, but little portions can serve our purpose to come closer to other people from other professional fields. So that means that we have to explain and show in a practical way how observing space and volume in space, how choosing camera positions or a smartphone position, it's the same thing, how selecting, the process of selecting before even going into editing software are very, very important processes, very important steps, and can happen in small activities that we have placed by deconstructing film language itself. So, and here comes the truth again from our experienced pedagogue, that film is always very time consuming. Of course, we know that. It's amazingly time consuming, and it's a problem. And people end up breaking their brains on top of different softwares and laptops, and still a cable is missing, or a software is missing, or a file is not readable. So we face this all the time, even at a professional level. So how could we offer media language to people who are not professionals? This is again the same question, and I think it's coming all the time. It doesn't mean, to be honest, that mobile phones have sorted these problems. I think we still have issues, and the answer for that, for me, is to understand a complete narrative through the little elements. I'll give a small example of how a simple activity, which I describe further in my article, can help people understand what means positioning and framing. And from that little very simple detail, we can work towards more complicated forms. This was a simple portrait exercise, but there are 3 points I would like to give. The one thing is that we are using contradictory and things from in the different poles, a very close-up, a very strong close-up, and a wide shot. And these are actually the A and Z of film language. And if one understands the beauty and the richness of this, then they can really become a part of this community. I'm including the making of stills on the right side, because I would like us always to remember how training is a condition of communication, collaboration, participation, and realizing what is inside the frame. When we're looking only on the left side, we forget the process. We forget what it means looking through an iPad, or looking through a phone, or looking through a DSLR camera, and what it can mean to discuss together the details of a picture. And I think in my experience, discussing on the result is a process of huge importance. And this can happen with very simple activities. Following, as I said, the concept of the detail, you will find a description of different kinds of what could be said, media literacy and semiotic activities. In that case, I was giving a lot of importance on understanding how objects can be the focus of our attention, and how an object, you can have a look here at these pictures, can take different meanings depending on how we place an object within a social environment, depending on how we bring our bodies and postures and our theatrical positioning in relation to an object. And these are very common things in everyday life, but when you freeze a frame, I think they become much more stronger. And we are able also to observe and analyze what happens when we freeze a moment in time. And these series of activities offer this possibility. So teachers were very able then to realize the alternatives, the variations. Actually, it's all about creating visual variations that I was working on. And I'm not going to ask you to read all that, it's available, but the other aspect I was focusing on is to have one theme, as I showed you in my table, the detail, and many different ways to work around it, to exemplify, to have in a way arguments, hands-on arguments. The activities take the role of an argumentation for me. So there were different activities that the detail, the close-up was the protagonist. And I think in that way, we come closer and closer to understanding the strength of this of the medium of media, because we have to remember that the close-up is actually the characteristic of film. Theater is not based on close-up. Painting is, but if it is, it's only a close-up. You can't have at the same time a dialogue around close-ups and wide shots. So I think the film is the medium that gave value to this idea. And here another practical example of what it means to observe and to decide what you will put in a frame. Here is one of these semiotic activities where the teachers had to think what would be the relationship to the object of the photography. Here, the object of the photography was a little video camera with a grabbing, I don't know the word in English, a little mechanism that would grab it everywhere. So that was at that time very posh and very expensive. So we made this object worth of for taking a picture of. But you can see that the way that the group is posing, the way that they are expressing, the way that they are showing the object, and the way our colleague who has the role of the director of the group, there are plenty of choices in that case. Even if he goes one step on the right hand, or if he's moving his iPad with some degrees, the picture and the feeling of the picture will change so much. So that was the point of understanding the strength of the variations. Finally, one very interesting element that I believe very often we forget in these kind of trainings is the issue of sound. And that is something, again, I developed quite a lot. Sound, again, if you think about it very carefully, has again its own close-ups, its own layers, its own lengths and the background. It has very similar characteristics to the image, but we tend not to be so careful about it. So one very big portion of the training was development of the idea of soundscapes. And again, it was another way to use another different tools. The tools were recorders. The medium was sound. In terms of bodily participation, it was the mind and the ears that were participating. And of course, a lot of brainstorming that had to do with how can we create sounds? How can we grasp their meaning? And the meaning of sound is again related to how do we record a sound in an attentive and careful and also technically correct way. So it's technically correct, the sound, when you are close to it and when you're careful about its clarity. So it's again very close, very related to the idea of the close-up. So of course, at the end of the training, there were bigger projects with short films that I'm not going to get into that. I don't want to develop that because it would take too long. But I want to finalize our discussion of combining different arts and, as I say, steal ideas from other art forms. That the experience shows that we really have to build the training, the art forms together from scratch. If we start building only one medium and then at the very end we want to introduce another one, usually it would not match. And this is what we paid attention to this training, and we proved that we combined the body and the mind and the image as an intrinsic, as a single organism. And I would like here to close with a picture I really like, because this is one of the final projects that they made, which is not a film actually, but it was a theater performance where close-ups were used with a multitude of tablets, taking their own strength and their own role in creating a new image. So the new image consisted of real actors, of a lot of images, which are all in close-ups, and each of them give their own information. So the wide shot and the close-ups are combined to produce a new meaning. And I think this picture really incarnates the connection of theater and film as a collective and unified way of expressing and also teaching, because that was actually my original goal, to help and enhance the skills of this teacher group.
Thank you very much, Maria. Thanks. Well done. Clap, clap, clap. Virtual applause and real applause.
Thank you.
We've probably got maybe just a very short time for one or two questions. I haven't got any in the Q&A box at the moment. Is there anybody who'd like to raise a hand or indicate that they'd like to speak or paste anything into the chat box? I'll just ask one quick question while people are thinking, Maria. I mean, I'm interested in the emphasis that you place on the body and the relationship that has with drama and theatre. I had two questions actually. One is I'm just wondering whether you've had any experience of the drama teachers or pedagogues or educators learning anything from their experience with film, the other way around.
Actually, I learned a lot. I've been learning from theatre pedagogues since 2009. So actually, I think this workshop in Kassel was a natural continuation of my common working with them. And thanks to all these common workshops, I think that this Kassel workshop was my best of all the learning that had happened. I think that the theatre pedagogues realized the strength of the tools, of the digital tools, and were less afraid. When the film learning gets very low, then an adult, I think, can gain confidence. It's about destructuring the language, as I said before. And if we bring close the tool, the device, because we tend to give a lot of importance to devices, I think, and this is not the solution. The devices are just events in our life, and devices will be changing for the next years as well, I believe. So experiencing, when I started teaching, I worked with film and with little cameras. I asked for a little sponsorship from Kodak for my first group, and it were one-time use film cameras. Yeah. And that was exactly 20 years ago in June 2020, 2000. And now I think that the key concepts of my work are the same, but we are working with mobile phones. So it's not about the device, it's about using the ideas that the device can produce and taking bits and pieces of the film language and offering them to the other arts or to the other area, because it could be language teachers, Andrew. This time it was theatre pedagogues, and the point that helped me a lot is that they were very familiar with using their bodies. They were very courageous, they were very used to be expressive. They were not shy at all, of course. So the gestures were very strong, and that gave a very strong feeling to the training as a whole.
Great. Thank you very much. I've just noticed there's another question actually from Bernard McCloskey. Hello, Bernard.
Hi, Bernard.
Nice to see you. And Maria, Bernard says, Maria, good to see you and hear you again.
Yes.
He asks, did the teachers have an opportunity to try these approaches then with their students? And
Yes,
so,
yes. I was very lucky that I went back to Germany until the year before the pandemic. So I had 3 more years visiting a similar, more or less that group, and more theater pedagogues from the area of Frankfurt. So I know they've been using it. Actually, they've built a whole performance using the idea of the body and iPads. That was my last slide. So they did very well to steal the idea and develop it in a whole performance. And as I've been visiting and training, doing more trainings 3 years after 2016, I know that they were more relaxed about introducing the media, not in their performances as such, but also in their everyday theater pedagogue practice. So they got more familiar with deconstructing and stealing a little piece of an extract of a film, because we worked a lot with extracts, which I believe is very crucial in teaching. We worked a lot of using devices and activities of short length. So short length is very important for teachers, because they only got 50-minute sessions or 45-minute sessions in school. So that was always my aim, to be actually very realistic as well, because that is a school practice.
Thanks very much, Maria. And thanks for the question, Bernard. Nice to have you here. Okay, we're going to move on. Time is pressing. Thank you very much once again, Maria, and we'll pick up some of this in the final question and answer session, I hope. So just to introduce Eva next, she's Associate Professor at the University of Copenhagen, where she's Head of Section for Film Studies and Creative Media Industries. So Eva's research focuses on screenwriting and production in the film and media industries, and she has also had a long track record of relating this to film education. She's published widely in books and journals, of course, including ours, which is we're very happy about. And she recently has a book on production studies. She follows current developments in the film and media industries closely. She's a board member of the Danish Film Institute and also a film critic. She's currently running as PI a joint research project called Reaching Young Audiences, which I think she'll refer to here, which focuses on serial fiction and cross-media story worlds for children and young audiences. So, Eva, we're looking very much forward to hearing it. Over to you.
Thank you very much, and thank you for this kind introduction, and very nice hearing your presentation, Maria. I'm very glad to be here to discuss this important topic of film education. I don't have any slides, so you were stuck with me talking and my face on screen, so hopefully this will work out. So I'm coming from a theoretical analytical perspective. In Denmark, we have the practical teaching of filmmaking at the film school, and then at film studies at university, we have sort of the more traditional film studies. And that's where I'm looking at film education from this more historical, theoretical, analytical perspective. So I'm currently PI of this research project, focusing on fiction for children and young audiences, where we deal with serial storytelling and cross-media fiction. So we've been doing a lot of case studies of how Danish television for children is produced, fictional formats at the moment. And this is where this article comes from. So seeing this new development in the field of Danish film and television, where we have this new educational initiative focusing specifically on teaching people to write for children and young audiences across media and in different ways. But having said that, I've had a long interest in film education in very many different ways. So I did a PhD quite a few years back on collaborations between directors and screenwriters when developing new feature films in Denmark. So looking at these creative collaborations and the different roles in the process. So I started by focusing on the education of screenwriters more generally. And it was interesting to see that for many years in Danish filmmaking, there was no place one could train to be a screenwriter. So the National Film School of Denmark started in 1966, And this was at the height of the new wave, La Nouvelle Vague, and there were all these ideas of the auteur and of directors being not only directors, but writer-directors. This was not necessarily what was meant in the new wave, but this very much was how it was interpreted in Danish filmmaking, making it very hard for screenwriters, of course. And there's been a lot of wonderful research on how European screenwriters have been marginalized by these ideas of the auteur at this point in time. So in the 60s, there was no place you could train for becoming a screenwriter, and this storytelling blindness that a lot of directors have actually described, because they had to just invent ways to tell stories themselves. I've written about this in an article for Journal of Screenwriting if you're interested, but it takes many years before we actually have a place where you can train for becoming a screenwriter in the Danish film and television industries. And of course, this is really important in terms of having a place where you can gain a professional identity, not only learn a craft, but also get a network and learn how to collaborate with other professions in this very collaborative art form of filmmaking. My later interest in film education has been on how to teach the writing of television drama. So I started a new research project focusing on the making of Danish television series, such as Borgen. There was not just a new season out, and The Killing. And there I was very interested in studying how does a writer's room work? What does it look like when many writers are collaborating on creating the best series possible? And in that project, I wasn't thinking I should focus on film education, but that ended up very much being the case, because what I could see was that it had been a very long journey teaching people how to collaborate in a writer's room, where one writer is the head writer and the others are episode writers, and it's very hard to get notes and have your text rewritten. And how can you actually teach people in film school to accept these different roles and work in these different contexts? And actually then head of drama at the Danish Broadcasting Corporation said that the secret behind the success of the Danish series that started traveling at that point in time was actually a TV term at the National Film School, where they taught screenwriters to write this particular kind of content, these 1-hour drama series for Sunday nights, and taking on these different roles. So film education was regarded as very important. And this TV term was also interesting because it was not only for screenwriters, it was a collaboration between screenwriters, producers, and production designers. So at a very early stage when developing concepts for new TV series, you had to talk about the visual identity of a series. You had to have these conversations about what does this look like? What does it sound like? What the different arenas are we in? And that has meant a lot for the visual look of the series for sure. So I've had a long interest in this field before writing this on how to think of this new education on writing for children and young audiences as an interesting new development in the Danish film and television industries. And of course, I built on important work of other scholars in this field. For instance, the very impressive 2-volume anthology, The Education of the Filmmaker by Professor Mette Hjorth, who will be at the conference later, and studies of particularly UK film schools and training initiatives. And this research is very much pointing to the constant tensions between being an art school, teaching young people to go out and make the strongest content possible, artistic films, realize their own visions, and then the skills needed to actually make films come alive in this collaborative art form. And I just have a brief quote by Mette Hjorth, which I think is really good also in terms of saying, why is this so important? Why is it important to study where people train for particular roles? As she says, it's important to find out how people become a particular kind of filmmaker, where kind, and now I quote from Mette Hjorth, encompasses skills as well as narrative and aesthetic priorities, preferred modes of practice, and understandings of what the ideal roles and contributions of a film would be. End of quote. So these particularities and the ideas of quality and best practice that you're taught in a film school, of course, really influences how you move into an industry and the kind of content you focus on. And in the Danish context, just the fact that the film school started to also teach the writing of television and serial television was a major game changer in the Danish industry. So lots of stuff to still focus on in terms of the education of screenwriters, but I will now move on to talk about this particular focus on writing for children and young audiences. So my article has this very long title, Cross-Media, Co-Creative and Current New Strategies for Educating Talent for Danish Children's Film and Television in the 2000s. And what's interesting about this new cross-media approach to teaching writing is that it mirrors a lot of developments that we're seeing in the Danish film and television industries at the moment. So we used to only have the National Film School as a major training ground and a few independent places. But in these past just few years, we've, for instance, seen Netflix establish training grounds for new talent. So this very commercial global SVOD player has established a collaboration with the state-funded and national film workshops on teaching Danish talent to develop and write TV series specifically for Netflix. And I've had the opportunity to sit in on some of the lectures, and it's been very interesting to hear how Netflix has taught storytelling. What do they think a good series should look like, and also listen to the lectures on diversity, how diversity in content and in the making of the series is very important. We've also seen private production companies establish their own training grounds. So we're seeing all these industry players trying to train the kind of talent that they specifically want, and teaching a very, very particular kind of film or television making with a very, very clear agenda. So very strong industry partnerships certainly in these training grounds that have until now mostly been state-funded or very much coming from the grounds up among different kinds of talent. So it's interesting with the cross-media school for children's content because it's this first training ground where we're actually seeing a school focusing specifically on the young audience. And it's there's never been this kind of training ground. There's been schools for teaching how to write children's literature, but nothing on the audiovisual content for children. And that's partly because it's always been the idea that you could move in from children's television. It wasn't that hard. It's also been an area with low prestige and lower pay than many other kinds of content. And actually on Monday, there was the annual fiction day at the Danish Film Institute with a session of the importance of writing for children and young audiences, where they were trying to make it visible and attract more established content instead of always seeing people starting their careers in children's content and then moving on to more prestigious stuff. So retaining talent in writing for children is really hard, and something that we're working on in the Danish film and television industries at the moment. And there's some wonderful research out there also on how you can very easily become pigeonholed when writing for children. So if you stay there, people are afraid that they will never be considered a serious writer. So there's a lot of tensions in this field of writing content for children and young audiences. And looking at the Danish context is very important to understand that since 1982, we've actually earmarked 25% of the funding for children's content for children and young audiences. So it's a substantial part of the film funding that we're allocating to this particular audience. And also, of course, this audience is a very important part of the public service remit. So we're really taking this audience seriously, and yet we haven't had any particular training grounds for how to actually make strong content for this audience. So the Cross-Media School of Children's Fiction, I argue in the article, is important and interesting for many reasons. At first, because it's this new and first place for actually teaching audiovisual writing of content for children. And then because of the cross-media focus, so instead of developing a story, they're encouraged to develop story worlds and what could possibly be intellectual property, IP that could roll out across different media. So an idea might be good for a series, but it could also be books and games and something else, and thinking about this from the very outset. Then I was also fascinated by the fact that it's very clearly written into the mandate of the school that writers should develop content in a close collaboration with children. So actually involving the audience that you're writing for to be certain that you are actually creating something that might be of interest, or at least to try and ensure, you can never be sure, that there is more focus or an interest in the audience group. And that's also a fourth point that I find is interesting in the school, the fact that there's a lot of teaching about what does the industry look like right now? What is the media use of children? So having knowledge about this makes it easier for you to find out what would be the best outlet or platform for my idea, and how should I maybe tell this story in a particular way. And it's, of course, very important to say we have a lot of audience research going on now, and this dialogue with children is very important, but also there's a very clear sense, both at the DFI and the Danish Broadcasting Corporation, that data is not something that dictates what should be done, but it might enlighten you, and having knowledge about current media industry structures and the media taste of the audience can qualify your ideas, but it should never sort of dictate what is going on. So that is sort of the cross-media co-creative and current focus of the articles. And of course, many things when writing for children is similar to writing for adults, about having strong characters and strong stories and creating engagement, etc. And there's a few manuals out there, but they're all focusing on writing literature for children. Actually, I found one in Hebrew that is about writing audiovisual fiction. It's a very nice book, but it's really remarkable how little is out there. So I have a forthcoming chapter in the Palgrave Handbook of Screenwriting Studies about writing for children, where I focus on how is writing for children thinking about a particular audience. How do you think about different modes of address when writing for children? For instance, do you have a single mode of address just trying to communicate with children, or do you have a dual mode of address trying to also communicate with their parents? Noel Brown, a British scholar, has been writing a lot about this in terms of the children's film, and has a wonderful new book out about this. And then also this issue of not only writing for children, about children, but also with children. And this is where I was very curious in studying what's going on at the Cross Media School, because we're seeing this development in many different aspects of the Danish film and television industries. For instance, at the Danish Broadcasting Corporation, where they are now developing series in close collaboration with children, and also they hire what they call junior editors. So children that are actually taking on a professional identity and working as part of the production framework, reading dialogue and giving feedback to ensure that what is created is not cringe and really embarrassing adults talking to children. We're also seeing at the Danish Film Institute, where there's a lot of audience research into the children and young audiences to use this knowledge for creating new projects. So I was interested in what does this look like at the school, and at the point of writing, I hadn't done those case studies, but we're currently conducting those. We're also looking into this in different ways. For instance, how a do-it-yourself director, writer, such as Jonas Risvig, developed a series during the pandemic. So when all schools were closed and children were at home, he figured now is the time to do a series together with children, and also encourage them to do their own series. And this became a very popular series, Centrum, on YouTube, that was actually also meant to teach children and young audiences to make their own series. So we're seeing all these new interesting also do-it-yourself initiatives in different ways. So since writing the article, I've done these different observation studies. There will be more coming, and there's a lot of interesting developments. And a nice news is that the school has just been funded in the new media agreement. So it has funding to continue the work. It started as a very independently run project, and now they actually have money to continue this important work in the years moving forward. So what started as this very independent, growing from the ground up initiative is now actually a state funded project for the years to come. So yeah, but I think I'll end it there, and if there are any questions, I'll be happy to answer, and also hear if you see similarities in your different international contexts. Thank you from me.
Thanks very much, Eva. There is one question, or a couple of questions already, actually. But, well, they're both from Saskia, who asks, first of all, presumably in Denmark you have a quota. You can see it in the chat, I think, Eva, if you go there. You have a quota built into the government funding to produce children's content. But she then says, yes, so I guess she's found the answer to that.
Yeah, we do. We have the 25% of the Danish Film Institute funding allocated for children and young audiences, and then there's also a separate budget from the Danish Broadcasting Corporation. So it is an audience that we take very seriously.
Yeah, that's good. Yes, quite enviable, in fact. And then she asked, how can we follow you and find out more about this education project for children's content?
If you look at our project website, that's where we will publish forthcoming publications. So there will be more on the school. And I think that the website of the school is only in Danish so far, and you can only attend the school if you speak Danish. But I will definitely, we will be publishing more on this and the way that they teach. I observed the teaching of interactive storytelling in the fall, which was very interesting. And I just talked to the head of the school on Monday, and she said that now the first cohort of students had submitted their projects, and she found they were very strong. And of course, she should say that as the head of the school. But she also commented, and I think that's very interesting, that there were no cross-media projects. And that's what we're seeing in our research project, that everyone's talking about cross-media and nobody's doing it because it's really hard and it's very expensive. So if any of you have really excellent cross-media cases out there, I'll be happy if you could send me an email and point me in the right direction, because we're really looking to see, are there actually any very inspiring cross-media projects out there, or is this just a buzzword that everyone's talking about and nobody's doing it?
Yeah, it's interesting. I guess it is a preserve of the giant franchises and the big American companies, isn't it? It's very hard to fund in the context of local or a national film culture, but would be great to do.
We have the very interesting format of the Christmas calendar in Scandinavia, where we produce 24 episodes of fiction for every night leading up to Christmas in the month of December. And last year's Christmas calendar was actually a cross-media attempt to get children interested in natural sciences. And we've been writing a blog about that for Critical Studies in Television. And that's one of the few cases we've seen, but that was a very ambitious attempt to create a serial fiction, highly entertaining story that would make children interested in natural sciences.
Okay,
that's
great.
Basically our only very good case.
Yeah. I had a question actually, which was about language. I remember many years ago at the Malmo Children's Film Festival seeing a animation of Hans Christian Andersen. I think it was The Ugly Duckling by a Danish animation company from Copenhagen. And it was being watched by a group of Swedish primary school children. And the interesting thing was that it was in English. And there were many commercial reasons why it was in English. You know, they wanted an international market and so on. But I'm just wondering, in the context particularly of Scandinavian children's kind of viewing of English language and particularly American film and television, whether there's anything in this training program that addresses the question of language. You know, is it about preserving Danish language film culture, or is there some negotiation with the sort of, you know, international
they can work in any language. I mean, if they want to do a big production for Netflix at the school, they're free to do that. So there's not a national agenda or language issue as such.
Right.
And that's of course different when you're receiving funding from the Danish Broadcasting Corporation for national television or from the Danish Film Institute. But I think from the educational perspective, they're very open for maybe developing the new big fantastic story world that can both be a franchise on Netflix and something else. So, but being 5.8 million people, we also, of course, have to watch for our national television language, at least.
Yeah.
For children.
Thank you very much. Okay, that's great. Thanks again, Eva, and we may have more questions later on if we have a bit of time. We're gradually eating into it, so we may not have much time at the end, but it doesn't matter. Great, thank you so much. Lovely to hear you. And we'll move on to Joe. Who I think is lurking there in the background. So there he is, he's just appeared. So Dr. Joe Goldberg he's a nationally board certified secondary English teacher. He's a practicing English teacher, I know. In fact, I believe he's off to school pretty soon after this session ends. It's very early in the day there in the States. He's a master teacher of honour with the International Honour Society of Education, and he's an adjunct professor at Syracuse University. His PhD research was focused on film pedagogy in the secondary English classroom, as was mine, I have to say, actually. And his publications can be found in the Journal of Media Education and in the English Journal and elsewhere, including, of course, our own illustrious journal, which, as before, we're very happy about. So his presentation is called Subverting the Stigma of Film in America's English Classroom. Over to you, Joe.
Good morning. Thank you so much for having me. I wanted to first express my appreciation to all of the members of the Film Education Journal. Their support and feedback was just remarkable in helping me to polish and finalize the article that I contributed. And also thank you so much to the first two panelists. I learned so much already this morning. Those were fantastic presentations. I'm a little bit nervous now to try to follow up. Just a little bit of background. I suspect, like everybody present here today, I've just always loved film. Growing up, was just somebody who was sort of intoxicated by the medium. When I first became an English teacher, it was just something instinctual for me to incorporate film into the classroom. I think back now on how I worked with it in my early stages as a teacher, and I rather cringe. And I'm hopeful to become better every year moving forward too. But it certainly motivated me to want to look more closely and investigate how film was being used in the English classroom. My understanding is that this is not entirely unique to the state that I live in, New York State. I'm about 5 hours or so north of New York City, just for some context. Or that it's unique only to the United States. But certainly I've always felt as a practicing English teacher, there's a stigma that is very much associated with film in the classroom. And so that was sort of the impetus for my wanting to pursue it more deeply, just knowing, again, instinctually, but also the more I experimented in the classroom with it, that film absolutely was a medium worthy of study, I think absolutely necessary for study, and certainly should be a comfortable fit in the sort of textual studies context in an English language arts classroom. And I'll try to get into screen share here. And you can see I've kind of framed this in this idea of a sort of lengthy war. Maybe that rhetoric is a little bit strong. But part of the reason for that has to do with the lengthy history of film in the English classroom in the United States. And so for a little bit of context, it was very soon after the advent of film that English teachers were already working with it. But at the same time, certainly film was subject to very, very heavy criticism. Though perhaps a little bit hyperbolic, a couple of these early publications at the turn of the century reveals just how passionate people were for, but also very much against film, sometimes characterizing it as a dangerous opponent of educators, or quite hyperbolically even satanic. And that was in the English Journal of the National Council of Teachers of English, remarkably. Though film became ubiquitous, of course, in the American English classroom, and then, of course, around the world in other classrooms. And it also became codified in the English language arts standards in the United States over the last quarter of century. It still remains heavily criticized in many regards. And part of that, I think, owes to the standards advocating for it, but also not giving much direction in terms of how to work with film in the English classroom. And certainly there's a significant dearth of pre and in-service teacher training. This is a little bit of a preview of a few things to come in my presentation, but as I conducted research among practicing teachers in the central New York region, which is where I live and I teach, there was not one of the dozen participants that I had that had actually received any training of any kind in their lead up to become English instructors or in service during their tenure as English teachers. And with 12 teachers, many of them veterans, though not all, there was, I think, approximately 250 collective instructional years, which to me is just stunning, to have not received even a 1-hour workshop of any kind in terms of pedagogy in working with film. I think as an extension of that, in many cases, broadly speaking, that's likely led to a lot of mispractice or malpractice with film. Oftentimes, film has been relegated to a sort of reward for students after conducting more serious academic labor, or with time remaining before holiday vacations and so on, or simply as a babysitter, unfortunately, Sometimes it's simply the plans for a substitute teacher. And that, of course, has led to a poor reputation for film in the English classroom. So I began with this research question: how do American high school English teachers make sense of and instruct with film? I used a qualitative framework, semi-structured interviews, and open-ended questions. I began with 6 of my colleagues, which was really productive because I had a sense of the diversity of their own practice and educational backgrounds and orientation to English language arts instruction, but also in terms of their use of film in particular. Using snowball sampling led me to 6 additional participants for a little bit more diversity in the participant pool. So I was able to recruit 2 secondary English instructors from urban, rural, and private school settings. Certainly there were some limitations for the research. It's a relatively small sample size and not nearly as much racial diversity amongst the participants as I certainly would have desired. I'm not sure if that's probably a little small in detail, but just to get a sense of the participants here and the diversity of their years of practice and some of the various courses that they teach, which ran a wide gamut of core classes from 9th grade through 12th grade, as well as numerous different elective courses as well. Some of my most veteran participants had been teaching for approximately 25 years, and I think the least experienced participant had only been teaching 6 years at that point, which put him, interestingly enough, closest to pre-service education. And even in the 20 years that had lapsed from my most veteran participant to this least experienced participant, even he reported minimal to no training in his educational background in terms of film studies. In reporting out some of the findings, one of the most notable and striking to me, again, was this idea of a stigma that just continues to dog film in the English classroom, even over 100 years after its advent, which just seems like a sort of echo of the same criticisms that it's had from its very beginning in its introduction to the English classroom. Remarkably to me was that this cut across all strata of the educational system. Participants described students being very hungry for film in the classroom, very excited and motivated by that. However, many reported that their students in the classroom also viewed it very much as essentially a day off from doing any sort of work. Several of the participants described being challenged by parents of their students and shared that they were often characterizing using film in the classroom as essentially dumbing down the curriculum. Also, several participants described even their own colleagues accosting them over their use of film, or occasionally setting up a field trip to a local movie theater. And very prominently as well were reports of administrators in some cases, which were primarily in the participants from urban school settings, described administrators actually banning the use of film in the classroom. However, to a person, all 12 of the participants adamantly resisted the idea that for them in their classrooms that film would be a day off. And that very much begged the question whether or not they viewed film, as is often characterized by its critics, as a very passive medium. Their answer was it is active as well as passive, just like any printed text. In that, English instructors can make the educational experience of film as active or as passive as they so choose to make it. One participant described it or likened it to working with a printed text, which students could certainly have their eyes scanning over the page without doing much thinking, just as they could consume a film, sort of passive-mindedly. But they viewed it inherently as the job of the educator to instill and ensure that active participation was being instilled. And so many of them talked about different approaches for trying to elicit that sort of active thinking and participation. There's actually a little bit of a debate here amongst the various participants as I put their voices in conversation with one another. Some preferred using note-taking activities, having students answer questions, filling out graphic organizers while they were viewing the film to ensure that they were actively consuming the film and engaging in critical thinking. All of them talked about using the pause button. And this essentially raised an issue which was common to both the note-taking and filling out questions and graphic organizers, along with the pause button, was whether or not to be doing these activities as the film played. Some thought that this was essential for active engagement, but others worried that with students having their eyes down on their desks in dimly lit rooms, that their eyes would be off the very visual medium of film and how problematic that could be. Moreover, they also worried about simply interrupting the narrative, which is already problematic, of course, because of the strictures of class time. In the high school where I work, we do have what's known as block scheduling. So classes meet every other day, and it's usually an 83-minute class period, which in many regards works much better to maintain the continuity of the narrative, but including an entire feature-length film, even in that block scheduling format, is not possible. And certainly some schools meet daily for only 40 minutes at a time. So the narrative is going to be disrupted either way. For some of the participants trying to allow students the opportunity to enjoy the entire film from start to finish as it was intended to be consumed was much more important, and to afford time to come back to the film after first seeing it from start to finish to take second looks and closer looks. And so some of the new technologies, and that was referenced by a couple of the presenters before me, have certainly allowed for opportunities for second and closer looks in ways that were previously not possible, where typically, there's one copy of the film text that only the teacher had control over. But with video sharing platforms like YouTube and some others, certainly clips of films could be shared. And that's what a couple of the participants did, was set up opportunities for their students to take closer looks in analyzing the compositional choices and other elements that the filmmakers use to create and communicate meaning. As I investigated what the participants were hopeful to get out of using film, many of the responses broke down into a couple of different basic categories. Some of the participants especially focused on privileging what film communicates, and many spoke about, in particular, using film as a way to communicate or to share the experience of the theater. For them, ideally, seeing live theater would have been the best approach, but since that is so often not very available to students and to schools to be able to get to a live theater, and certainly not during the pandemic, for them, a filmed presentation of a theater text would have been the next best thing to do. Many spoke of this especially being essential for teaching Shakespearean text, particularly because of the challenging language for students. There was a little bit of debate there, and one interesting discovery that I made was some of the teachers hewed towards the very traditional reading a section of the Shakespearean play and then having students be able to see a filmed performance of it. But a number of the participants actually resisted that notion and talked about the importance of having students first experience Shakespeare or other plays as well, as it was intended, or as close to as intended as possible, which was through performance first, and then to have their students go and take closer looks at the printed text itself. I think there's an instinct that many believe that students would sort of get away with not needing to do the work of decoding the very rich language of Shakespeare or other playwrights. But many of the participants who were advocates for showing the filmed performance first actually found that their students had greater success and more motivation in trying to decode and understand Shakespeare's language. Many of the participants too, who focused on privileging what film communicates, were using it very much in service of trying to fulfill English language arts learning standards. For example, composing evidence-based arguments with film. They testified that many of their students are visual learners and simply would understand and see literary elements and be more motivated to talk about them as compared to a print text, though with the goal of extrapolating that skill set towards doing the same type of analysis with a printed text as well. In this regard, it definitely struck me that many of these participants were more framing the use of film as in service of developing print literacy skill sets. There were a couple of participants who did speak about using film simply for the sake of working with and teaching and learning about film, in addition to it being productive as a schema to apply to other forms of text as well. There were only a few of the participants who described methods and approaches that privileged how film communicates. In these cases, they very much delved into the grammar of film. Oftentimes they took an approach of having students notice things in a film or using a particular frame from the film on pause, and then trying to give them a vocabulary that would be common to everybody in the classroom to be able to discuss and name what those techniques or approaches that the filmmakers used were, with the intent, the larger intent on trying to answer the so what question. How do these particular elements and choices by the filmmakers create and communicate meaning? A couple of the participants were especially attuned to using some of these technologies that I referenced just a few moments ago, and not only finding clips of feature-length films to put in, if you will, the hands of the students via their access on an educational sharing platform such as Google Classroom, but also to use some of those other technological tools, likewise brought up by the previous panelists, in terms of being able to capture still frames from those clips, to also learn about film through video essays that are very prominent on video sharing platforms like YouTube. And a couple described actually getting their students to create film. One of them reasoning that he wouldn't teach poetry without having his students try to write poems. That was often a very big difficulty just in terms of the amount of time involved in doing such projects. But sometimes they would break it up into smaller activities. For example, one teacher had his students go into hallways and other building spaces after having storyboarded a short story idea to just capture with still frames on their mobile phones and assemble, analyze their choices, and share that out through a presentational slides with the rest of their classmates.
Well, just 1 minute, Joe, is that okay?
I just realized I was running a little short on time, so I'll try to get to the end here. I'm at my last couple of findings. One of the most remarkable things to me was, despite these dozen participants absolutely testifying to the efficacy of teaching with film, many of them realized in their interviews with me that they themselves essentially harbored a stigma against film. So that sort of cognitive dissonance actually resulted in them self-restricting their use of film. They had these sort of fears that they discussed that they didn't even realize that they had of overusing film. They described feeling defensive about using film, self-conscious, and essentially, in the words of one participant, projecting the criticisms of opponents of film in the classroom into their own practice. Many of them subscribing subconsciously to this idea that English language arts is very much print-centric, bibliocentric. A couple of them did mention, though, that articulating and talking through their use of film and the results that they get with film from their students made them feel like they had sound justification for using it in the classroom and granted them a feeling of having permission to use it. In conclusion, the data I collected absolutely supports unquestionably film to be a highly effective medium for achieving English language arts objectives. That modern educational technologies might allow unique access for students in working with film. Despite film's place in the standards, malpractice and stigma continue to plague it. I believe sharing pedagogic strategies with film from these participants and amongst others and increasing training is absolutely needed. And one major difference that I discovered between the testimony of the participants in the context of film instruction in the United States as compared to around the world is that in the United States, there's a very prominent lack of coordination between academic, political, and cultural institutions, educational organizations, and that's very much in need to create a more unified systemic shift to standardize and improve teacher preparation, professional development in service, educational frameworks, goals, assessments, and methods for teaching with film. So hopefully I didn't go too terribly over. Thank you for your patience. Happy to take any questions.
Thanks very much, Joe. Thanks for that. It rings a lot of bells with me in my past experience as an English teacher. Right, we've got a couple of questions already. So Saskia's got one. You can see them in the chat, which is, did you ever ask your students to make films at home as homework and then discuss them in the next class?
As a practicing teacher myself and trying to integrate film in more diverse ways, more effective ways, I certainly have. There was one of the participants that I had the opportunity to follow up with even more after having interviewed him. He certainly was somebody who had students doing that, sometimes in class, sometimes outside of class as well. Again, the technologies have made this more and more possible. In decentralizing, the production abilities for film creation.
Thanks very much. And we've got another question, which is just a practical thing in a way. Can you give some examples of films you have presented to the students?
Oh, very happy to.
I guess this is a long list, but just pick your top three.
Yeah. I guess just very briefly, for me, it often just depends on the course context. So if I'm teaching, an English core class versus one of the electives that I've created that is a film studies elective, and sometimes ranging from the most pop culture, sort of Hollywood blockbuster films, to some of the more, art house cinema films. I guess I'll say that amongst my students, I think, Martin Scorsese's Goodfellas is probably amongst the most popular. The Shawshank Redemption. Many of the participants discussed using film adaptations of novels, and certainly film presentations of play scripts.
Yeah, I was going to ask about the adaptation of literary texts, which obviously plays a part in this whole tradition, but I'm interested that you talked about the treatment of film as an art form in its own right, and also the examples you've given very quickly there are a really good illustration and something we often debate in the context of this journal, which is the sort of cultural range of young people's film landscapes and the importance of kind of addressing both the art house end and the kind of popular cinema end. Thanks very much for that. Okay, let's broaden it out and see if people have any questions for the whole panel. I've got one which is held over from Michelle Cannon, Maria, who I think you know from UCL. And she's thanked you for your talk, and she said she enjoys hearing about framing and your activities in relation to framing, and also links between the close-up and particular sound choices. She said, I wonder if we can frame sound for learners in ways that account for the world that is not bounded by the visual frame. And she goes on to say, is this an aesthetic excess spilling out and around the frame might be helpful to get away from the linearity of the timeline. So I guess she's just thinking about, of course we teach about framing, and I guess we teach about framing in time as well, which is why she's mentioned the timeline, which is another kind of framing, temporal framing. But I think she's sort of asking, is there a risk that becomes constrictive? How do we address the wider world beyond the frame, or what spills out outside the frame? Sorry, Maria, you're mute.
No,
yeah.
I could not find this question in the chat, but anyway, I will try to remember your.
Oh, it's in the question and answer button.
Okay.
If you click the Q&A button.
Fine.
Yeah.
Yes.
And you have to click on the answered tab, because we've
Perfect, because it was quite a complicated thought, Michelle.
Yeah.
So I need to read it. So,
yeah.
So I wonder if we can frame sound for learners in ways that account for the world that is not bounded by the visual frame. Yes, we can. So sound is a self-standing medium, but also a complementary medium, I think. So film practice or video practice, or however you call it, exemplifies this every day, that sound and moving image can be partners, can be contradictory, can be contrasting, can be adding one to the other. And I think training should always follow the professional experience, just to deconstruct it in smaller pieces, because otherwise it's quite hard to grasp it. However, the timeline again that you mentioned, Michelle, yes, film is linear, that's true. Maybe the cross-media issues that Eva mentioned do disrupt linearity, and I think we are now in a new land, all of us. The last 5 years, we just start understanding what XR, AR, VR, and cross-media really means. And if it is successful, if we can make it interesting or successful, it's not, I don't think it's already answered. We are just now trying to learn. We are learning at the moment, whether we are professionals or just viewers. And I find that breaking the timeline is the issue of today in terms of performative arts, in terms of video arts. This is the big question. Can we, and when and how do we break it? As far as framing comes, I was reading, doing some preparatory work on VR things. I'm quite interested in it. So I was reading interesting opinions by people who already use it. And of course, the frame does not exist in 360 environments, but still, I think that let's say the artist or the director still has to choose what kind of experience will happen in each moment, and what kind of frame or environment will be faced when you turn right or left. So it's a different kind of framing, but it still is a choice and a selection.
There's always some kind of framing.
So it's a wider, it's a 360 frame.
Exactly, and people talk about that.
It becomes a concept. It's not a rectangular thing, but I think it is a concept.
I wonder if we could open out the question of, I haven't got other questions here in general for the group, but I mean, maybe this question of the cross-media opportunities or imperatives almost, I guess, these days, we could open out. I mean, Eva's already referred to it, and she may have more to say. Joe hasn't referred to it, but might also have some things to say. Eva, what about you?
I think it's what I said, that it's a buzzword. Everyone's talking about it, and in Scandinavia, everyone was looking to Skam, the very popular Norwegian web series that managed to integrate social media in a very innovative way. But also it was very demanding for the showrunner to keep track of this whole way of telling a story, and also interacting continuously with the fans and the audience. So it's in many ways, depending on how you do it, a very demanding way of storytelling, and also very hard to teach, of course, but particularly if you don't have very good examples. So I think it's we're waiting for the excellent low budget examples Skam of how this can be done in different ways. But
I sometimes think those attempts at interactivity by television are a sort of desperate attempt to do something that video games already do better, and maybe should be left to them. But although the social media is a different angle, Sorry, I interrupted you.
No, I actually have a question for Joe, if it's okay.
Go for it,
And thank you for a very interesting presentation, Joe. I think it's a very important study you've done. And I was just wondering, because in Denmark, we have the Danish Film Institute, for instance, making a lot of teaching material for teachers. And that's sort of giving this a film and the material a quality stamp, saying this is official teaching material, and this has been done by official people, and this is important to teach. And that's a way of also making it less up to the individual teacher to invent something or come up with something. And there's a whole package, and it's made in an age-appropriate way. And it's for a lot of different topics. You can use film in history or in English teaching or in. So how is that in your context? Is there this availability of ready available teaching materials?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you so much. I think there are materials out there. I think especially there is scholarly literature, right? I mean, there are fantastic scholars in the United States, Renee Hobbs, for example, Mariella Rowe, who have produced, I think, remarkable work. There's just such a disconnect that I notice in this country between practitioners in the classroom and the scholarly literature. And that's kind of the reference that I had with that towards the end of my presentation. There's just such little coordination between the two. And with no pre or in-service training, at least typically for instructors, they don't much get exposed, I don't believe, to what is available. And I think just with the educational setup of the United States, with 50 different states, with 50 different curriculums, right? There's just such a lack of coordination. And I certainly find that tends to be true even between districts within the same state, even the same local area. What's happening in the urban schools 15 minutes away from the suburban schools or rural schools were widely different. And even amongst the 6 participant colleagues of my own, the diversity of practice was remarkable. A couple of the more sophisticated approaches that a few of the teachers had just owed to their own personal interest in trying to pursue studying film, whereas some others, they kind of have I think a more layperson experience with film and little access to these wonderful resources that you're saying are very much standardized, where you are. So I appreciate that question. I think that points to precisely one of the major obstacles.
Thank you.
Thanks, Joe. There's one final question which we can probably just squeeze in within the limits of our session. It's from Bernard. Again, hello, Bernard. To you, Joe, and he said, thanks for the presentation. He's asking what you think the resistance to film by US educators is based on. Is it that film, isn't valued as a medium for use in teaching? And I guess in that case, it's perhaps maybe in the context of is it a threat to the primacy of language, maybe in the language arts curriculum? Or is it positively dangerous as a negative influence to expose young people's minds to?
Yeah, I think it's a little bit of all of it. I think the latter is maybe becoming a little less so. Certainly at the turn of the 20th century with the advent of film, that was one of the absolutely biggest objections. I think it was the Chicago Tribune in 1907 that characterized film as more dangerous to children than all other forms of criminal activity combined. Nowadays, I think that's maybe a little less so just because society standards certainly shift over time. I do suspect if you asked, people, teachers, students, parents in one region of the United States versus another, you'd probably get very different responses to that question. And Andrew, what you just referenced, this idea of the primacy of printed text, which of course, as an English teacher, I value enormously, but I don't believe that needs to come at the expense of other forms of text either. And I think there's a very big bias about popular culture texts in general. And there's simply I think a bit of a different attitude about what film is in this country, probably compared to many others, where it's celebrated as an art form. And here I think it's viewed very much as, in many regards, low culture.
Interesting. I do notice in the States a separation out actually of film education and media education, whereas in the UK those are very close together. I mean, media educators tend to use film as their preferred dominant medium actually, even if they're teaching media studies. And then it's different across Europe and different again in the Far East. Still, it's kind of worrying to know that these old prejudices are still with us, but maybe with the help of you good people and our wider constituency, we can continue to challenge it into the future. Thank you all very much. Real thanks again to all our fantastic panelists this morning. Round of applause from everybody. Noisy one from me, virtual one from our invisible audience. And great to see you. Good kick-off to the conference. Thanks so much for beginning it in such an interesting way. Everyone, I think, now has a lunch break. Robert, shall I hand over to you for a closing remarks.
Yes, very well timed. Thank you very much, Andrew, and thank you very much to Joe, Eva and Maria, and to everybody who asked questions. It was, I agree, a brilliant start to the conference. Lots of food for thought. Our next panel is at 2 p.m. We'll be looking at film education in Palestine. That's 2 p.m. till 3:30, and then we have a couple of more events after that as well. So you should have the invites to those in your email inbox. Have a look in your other or spam folder in case you can't find them, because they come from Zoom and sometimes they can get hidden away. But thank you very much, everybody, for this morning, and we'll see some of you back here again at 2 o'clock. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for everything.